I would like to start this TED Talk with a small experiment, for which I would ask you the following. Think of a date within your own personal life that you consider to be one of the most important dates. And keep that to yourself. Then a second question. If you think about Europe, within the past 100 years, think of a date that you think that is very important for the history of Europe. And again, keep that to yourself, hold on to it, but I promise I will come back to it at the end. So keep those two dates. In this TED Talk tonight, I would like to explain why I think it is time to change from using our traditional timelines in history, and I would like to propose an alternative way of looking at history. What do I mean when I speak of timelines? Most of you might be familiar with timelines if you think about history from your textbooks. It's very difficult for us, if we think about the entirety of history of our world, of our planet, to think about that history all at once. And so what we're used to and what we've sort of developed over the past centuries is the use of timelines. We're trying to think about history in smaller compartments of periods, of smaller compartments of time. As if we have small building blocks, and these building blocks represent certain periods. And they're small enough for us and for our brain to really understand them. And if we put them together, they, in its entirety, they make up of history. And a few years ago, I started to think about this. How useful are these timelines, actually? And for some of you, if you have to study timelines for your courses, then they might also be a bit boring. And when I started to think about it, I started to study a bit more. Where does this custom of us to use timelines, where does it come from? Because I had the sense that we've been doing this for centuries. But really we're not. The inventor of timelines is this Frenchman, Jacques Barbe-Dubourg, in the early 18th century. He all of a sudden had this idea, I would really like to have sort of a form, a piece of paper or something where I can visualize the entirety of history. And so he started to put down and create a sort of timeline. And you see actually the instrument that he used for this. This is one of the originals, where he actually ended up with over 16 meters of timeline. And you see the machine here, you have to sort of, from one period to the other, you have to pull to the next. It's a sort of a very mechanical system. So we haven't really been doing that for a very long time. And I think that's interesting. Because it feels like, if I look at my own textbooks from when I went to high school and to university, it feels like we've been doing this for ages. Now, I'm an ancient historian, and that means I'm studying the world of the ancient Mediterranean. And perhaps some of you are familiar also with this very broad division that we use for the world of antiquity. We often use these compartments of time where we start with the ancient Near East and Egypt. Then we move to classical Greece. Then we talk about the Hellenistic age. And then we move to the Roman Empire. And in recent years, we also, and you see it here on the screen as well, on the slide, we also tend to talk about Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire. So we're trying to take a very long and prolonged world of antiquity, but we're very used to using these smaller compartments to simplify in a way, and also to help us understand these smaller periods. And these very traditional, and I also say artificial, constructions of time help us to move through the world of the Mediterranean. And in recent years, I've started to question this. Is this really how people in antiquity thought about themselves? if they hear us, and me for instance in my history courses, if they hear me teach about their world, would they really recognize this? A lot of these compartments are also generated by large political changes. If we move from classical Greece and we leave behind the classical age of democracy, we often move to the world of the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. So a change of regime. If we move from the Hellenistic age to the Roman Empire, then we move to a world of, at first, the Roman Republic, and then to the world of the Roman emperors. So we tend to use these breaks, these sort of, the way we set up these chronological boundaries, we use them often by looking at large political developments, at looking at the history of the great man, so to speak. And so recently I've started to think, is that really how people would have looked at their own world? Is that how we look at our own world? Would individuals and those people around the Mediterranean recognize themselves in our story? And I've also tried to think about this question. If we look at these different periods, is that also how we really should be connecting the world around the Mediterranean? Because the sea is really, I think, a connecting factor. But if we have these periods of time, then we tend to only focus on one specific area within the Mediterranean. And I think you probably have a sense of where I'm going. I think we should also rethink that way of those traditional chronological boundaries. And I was struck, puzzled, inspired, fascinated by this particular quote by Stephen Tanaka. And he's actually not an ancient historian. He's a scholar who is really interested and specialized and has a great expertise in the study of Japan. But he's also having an interest in chronology. And this particular quote, chronology orients us in particular directions away from people and experiences, really made me think, because I thought, this is also where I have started to doubt. What are we doing if we use chronology in our traditional timelines? And I think for me, for you also tonight, it's easiest to illustrate what I've been trying to do and what I've been thinking about by telling you a little bit about my own research. I study crowd behavior in the ancient world. What does that mean? And you see here on the slide a few illustrations, either modern reconstructions or actually objects from the ancient world that somehow show you a scene in which larger groups of people appear. I've studied the behavior of people in the arena, for instance. Only 2 weeks ago I was at the Colosseum in Rome, and I thought, oh yeah, this is what I study. How do people come together? How do they go in processions? The ancient world was full of rituals. How do they join? Where do people along the road stand? How do they cheer? Do they go to games, gladiatorial games, but also to horse races? Do they go together with their friends, with people from their neighborhood? What do they smell? What do they see? What kind of behavior and what kind of experiences do they have? And I've been studying this now for about 10 years. And I've come to realize in studying a lot of those experiences, and they come from ancient texts, sometimes they come from archaeological evidences, that really doesn't make a lot of sense if I use these very artificial chronological compartments of saying, okay, this is classical Greece, this is the Hellenistic age, this is the Roman Republic. Because for the experience of people during festivals or processions is very similar. And has a very universal element to it. So I've been starting to rearrange basically those chronological boundaries, because it doesn't mean that behavior is everywhere the same all the time. And I do realize that historical situations do change. So the historical context of an occurrence might change, but behavior might not change. And I think even if I take that all the way to nowadays, if you go to a soccer game, the way people cheer might be very much similar to people cheering at gladiatorial games. And so what I would like to propose is to rethink. I don't want to necessarily say, take away all those timelines, because I do understand that they might be useful also. But I would also make a plea for saying, let's rethink. If we look at history and human experience in history, if we study history, perhaps we should think about that. And that might change our view of history as well. And it might change the way we look at boundaries, because chronological boundaries are, in a way, a form of boundaries, and our world is full of it. And I think we're in a day and age that we're also rethinking lots of different kinds of boundaries, and those chronological boundaries are part of that. So in conclusion, I think I'll leave you with 2 points. First, I hope to have shown you a little glimpse of where in scholarship in my field we're trying to move away from very traditional ways of looking at chronology and trying to figure out new ways and alternative ways that might supplement and add to our existing knowledge. And second, if you take those 2 dates that I asked you at the beginning, what is the most important date in your personal life, and what is the most important date in Europe in the past 100 years, I'm almost convinced that what you picked for your personal life has probably much more to do with my alternative way of looking at chronology, and that the one you picked for Europe is probably more connected to our traditional way of looking at history. Is that right? Is that wrong? I leave that thought to you. Thank you.